Would like to introduce Scott Kirby, CEO of United Airlines. Thank you so much for being here and talking with us.
Happy to be here.
Good, thank you. And you? Good summer.
It was a good summer.
Good end to your summer.
Yeah, it ended well.
Okay. Well, you don't like to mince words, so I think maybe we'll start with bad news first.
Okay.
Disruptions have been in headlines. I'm responsible for some of those headlines. For a long time, customers are frustrated. There are a lot of weather delays. When do you think an airline operation, including yours, could possibly get around things like weather?
Well, the good news is actually August, at least for United, was the best summer month in our history, and so it went pretty well. The industry at large, including United, we're all kind of 10% overstaffed, so we've thrown resources at it to improve the operation for customers. But we're never going to fly through the middle of a thunderstorm, and we're going to always close the ramp when there's lightning that could hit an employee on the ramp. So that's not going to ever change. But dealing with it can be a whole lot better. It's the impact of weather today is several times worse than it was historically. And the biggest thing, and credit to them, this is not a complaint about the FAA, they are working hard to address this, but on their own numbers, they're 3,000 controllers short. It's most chronic in New York right now. It's not only in New York, but it's most chronic in the New York, New Jersey airspace. And so because of that, the same weather, that in the past we could have managed through, you now can cause hundreds of delays or hundreds of even cancellations, and that's the biggest challenge. And they're on it, and the communication level we have with the FAA, certainly from my perspective, the transparency, the honesty, the open communication is better than it's ever been. But this was 2 decades in building, and it's going to take years to get it addressed.
And you were mentioning something interesting backstage that you're starting to do, because when there's a delay, a customer might say, it's sunny. Why is Newark a mess today?
Yeah.
Or
so
some other airport.
Newark it can happen anywhere, but Newark, the way it works is the weather almost always, the thunderstorms come in from the west. And what's been happening now is it closes the departure routes. So you can't depart airplanes because the FAA won't let you fly over the departure routes. And a lot of times those thunderstorms are far enough to the west that you really can't even see them. You're at Newark and it's a sunny, clear sky, blue sky. It looks like a sunny, clear, blue sky day, and we're telling people it's weather, and they think we're lying, understandably. So what we've just started doing this, but is sending them a radar picture of here's where the weather is, and the next iteration we're going to actually put your flight path and show that you should be flying, and right here is your departure point where you turn and go west, and it's in the middle of a thunderstorm, and that's why. At least to try to be more transparent with customers. And we got a whole bunch of other stuff that's happening beyond weather. I think one of the keys to customer service for the future, and United is doing it more than any other airline, is trying to get transparent, open, honest communication. Like weather is going to happen, and other things. We're going to have maintenance issues sometimes, and weather overwhelmingly is the delays and cancellations. But when those things happen, to be able to tell people why and take out the uncertainty and at least explain it, I think is kind of the next generation of customer communication.
Is there any staffing internally that you're looking at that could help mitigate delays, especially with kind of crew displacements and things like that? So
the biggest, we have doubled the amount of people that we have on the crew scheduling desk since June. We've literally doubled it. Technology is really the better answer for that. At United, at least, we have clauses in our, this is crazy, I mean, it's like 1970s. We have clauses in our flight attendant contract that require us to call people on the telephone and talk to them on the telephone. I mean, it's a requirement, instead of using an app or any other way that you would communicate. And when you're having to call people and you have to call them multiple times before you get through, all you can do is have more and more people. So that's the only place that we've really changed staffing, and it's really just so you can make more phone calls.
And do you think that there's a chance that customers are going to get kind of turned off to air travel because of those disruptions that we've seen lately, or even before the pandemic? Or do you think there's no other way to get across the country or some places they want to go?
The short answer is no. And I think certainly at United, and I think kind of across the board, we're doing a better job of communicating and explaining to customers. And most people when they travel know that things like weather are going to happen and are pretty understanding. Not 100%, but most are pretty understanding. But one of the things coming out of COVID too is we all have, I think, a greater appreciation for experiences, for travel. We no longer take it for granted. Demand is higher than it's ever been in history, and I don't see that changing.
Do you think customers are fairly compensated when there are disruptions?
So I think a bedrock of aviation, probably the best thing about the U.S. aviation industry is safety. Safety is number one. It is in the DNA of everyone that works at an airline. Like nobody ever questions if there's no gray area. If there's anything, it is a black and white, and we either delay or we cancel the flight, and that's the culture that we have, and we should not change that. In fact, if you want to talk about Boeing, I think Boeing was an example. They've turned this around, but the Boeing-McDonnell-Douglas merger, everyone says, changed the culture from a great engineering safety culture to a cost-focused culture. And guess what happened? It took 10 years, but 10 years later, 2 airplanes went down because the safety culture changed. And we should never, ever, ever risk changing the safety culture in aviation. I do not want a pilot. I do not want a mechanic thinking about the cost, the extra cost of a delay or cancellation when they're making a safety decision. I'm adamant about it. We should absolutely never change the great safety culture we have in aviation.
And when things do happen, I mean, you don't want to fly a plane that's broken or has a,
that's right.
Obviously, it'll cost you a lot more than the repair.
Yeah, and look, the airlines, for things that are really within our control, the metrics aren't correct today because things that are either weather or FAA delays don't get coded that way. But the things that are within our control are the lowest, not just at United, across the whole U.S. aviation industry. They're the lowest that they've ever been. We're not perfect, but they're big, complicated airplanes. And to your point, we don't want anyone thinking about the cost associated with making a close call decision on should I delay or cancel this flight. We want them 100% focused on safety. And we've built a culture. The culture in aviation doesn't exist in any other industry, nowhere close in any other industry. And it's the bedrock that the industry's built on, and we should not crack the bedrock.
Do you think there's any chance that the United States does increase compensation for passengers and things? There are some things in airlines control, some things are not. You cannot control thunderstorms yet.
Well,
but
I certainly hope not. And I have said this to the Secretary Buttigieg personally, and I'll say it every time anyone wants to talk about it. This is a safety culture issue. And the reality is there's probably nobody that's more qualified than me to understand the safety implications and where it intersects with culture. And we have great safety culture. I think it would be a massive mistake to jeopardize that in any way, shape, or form. And you can probably tell, I, for one, will be adamantly vocal and vocally opposed to changing it.
In terms of reimbursements or things like that.
Yeah, the kinds of rules that are in Europe.
Yeah.
We don't fly that. We don't have enough flights to Europe that it really dramatically impacts the culture. But you don't want, and think about low-cost carriers, maybe it doesn't change immediately at big airlines like United or American or Delta, but a low-cost carrier and somebody's worried about their job. Is my company going to be here tomorrow? And you tell them all of a sudden, if you delay or cancel this flight, it's going to cost your company a god-awful amount of money. You don't want people thinking like that. It's just fundamentally bad.
In the time we have left, I want to talk a little bit about the supply chain issues. Some of the companies here have been in the news. When are you going to get the airplanes that you need?
Well, everyone in the industry, Boeing, Airbus, all the engine manufacturers, kind of everyone is having supply chain. They're not the only ones. It's true in every industry that I read about. So they are having supply chain challenges. But I feel pretty good about it. The path that we're on and where they are. I don't expect perfection in the short term. And I think particularly both of the aircraft manufacturers are headed in a pretty good place. And, for Boeing specifically, I think this cultural point is really important that, they had a turning point with the culture after the McDonnell-Douglas merger. And I think Calhoun deserves a lot of credit for turning the culture around. It feels different. I know Boeing. I spend a lot of time with them. It is different today. And he and his leadership team have done a lot. And it doesn't always turn into, delivery results tomorrow. Those things take time. You're changing the culture, but I think they're on a really good path, and feel pretty good about where we're headed for the future.
And the other big shortage besides aircraft is pilots, of course. Where do you see that going? And we've seen a lot of small cities already lose service.
Yeah.
Do you think that's going to continue into 2024?
I think it's a probably forever problem. It's hard to become a pilot, particularly going the civilian path. At United, we've created the Aviate Academy, putting 500 more pilots a year through that, which makes a difference. But we need policy changes if you're going to really address the pilot shortage. I mean, the truth is, for an airline like United, it's not, we don't have a hard time hiring pilots at United Airlines mainline. Now, our regional has a hard time, so we aren't flying to as many small cities as a result. But for the whole industry, the industry produces 5,000 to 6,000 pilots a year, and at least half of that is just for retirement. And United, by the way, is hiring between 2,500 and 3,000 pilots per year, and we can hire. So, the further down the food chain you go in pilots, the harder and harder it gets.
And are you in favor of the pilot age going up?
We're not taking a position on that.
And then just in the few minutes that we have, what role do you see automation playing in aviation, whether that's in the cockpit or elsewhere in the
Well, I think automation is going to be really important. It still is important. Will continue to grow in importance. I think, from a consumer perspective, being easy to deal with and giving people better information. I think artificial is one of our first use cases for AI, is actually telling people what's going on when you have a flight delay or cancellation. Apparently somebody showed me a screenshot. Apple today did their big event, and United was one of the featured with our app, and the cool stuff that we're doing in the app there. But there's and the technology for aircraft is going to continue to get better and better and better. But I don't actually see, some people ask, are we going to have autonomous aircraft? I think the answer is no. Maybe for small airplanes, eVTOLs, but I don't think you're going to see a autonomous or single pilot airplane flying, from Dulles to Paris or from Dulles to LA or anything like that.
What about Newark to Dulles?
Not from Newark to Dulles either. That's the most complicated airspace in the world. You can fly to Paris a lot easier than you can fly between Newark and Dulles.
Got it. Scott Kirby, CEO of United Airlines. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.